let's say you are a large company and you have a ton of these resources. How do you preserve semantics that are specific to a certain domain but do not apply to all domains? Let's say that customers is a common thing. You may have a identity or onboarding onboarding, let's say, domain that has a notion of customers. You may have a customer support domain that may have a different view of customers as a resource. How do you prevent collision of a customer's resource across these different representations and different domains? And over time, right, you may have more acquisitions, you may have more business capabilities that evolve that could create more opportunities for fragmentations and collisions around these resource representations. So to protect our kind of identity or right uniqueness of our resources, we should always, and I think we should do it upfront, we should always apply the notion of a namespace. So we need to create a scope for all of our resources by applying a namespace. So in the example that I think Usha you put there out there, I think I could see a namespace out there. So if your resource, let's say in this case, titles, right? If titles could potentially collide with another title somewhere else, right? Or users, as we took another example, could collide with another users out there, right? It makes sense to provide a namespace for the domain that you are designing that this resource model for. So in our case, let's say our domain is library. Then we can put it as part of our resource path immediately before our primary resource. So, and this should not be confused with another primary resource here, because right, if you see, it is not plural and the identifier is missing here. So what it also makes a case for is if you are using namespaces in your resource representations, then you should use it consistently across your entire API platform, right? So this is a decision you need to make early in your evolution. If you're going to use namespacing, use it consistently and use it for all your resources. So examples of namespaces are identity for identity management, right? Or credit for credit management. You could have onboarding for onboarding API, right? So it's a good idea. I would strongly recommend applying a namespace that represents your business capability that the resource represents. We should not confuse namespacing with product packaging, right? So if you have, let's say, right, a product called whatever, Power Pack 2, right? Something, you have some version product name there. You shouldn't use product nomenclature in here. Anything that goes in this path has to be durable. That means it has to indicate a standardized business capability in agnostic nomenclature, right? So you shouldn't have something that is just right a product nomenclature that is transient or could change over time. So that's namespacing. Another important thing that is even more crucial is versioning. So semantic versioning typically means we follow major, minor, and patch revision to reference a version. Now, what does a patch revision mean to an API? API is an interface. So can you adjust an interface after you have rolled it out? we can, right? We can maybe change some descriptions on the schema to make it more readable, right? So you could have these kind of changes where you are just fixing something that does not impact the formal implication of the interface contract itself. If you did update, right? If you did update some documentation onto an API contract, do you need to broadly communicate it? Not always, right? So if you're not adding anything to the contract, not removing anything from the contract, you're just doing incremental updates to the description, it has no significant contract impact. And that's why patch revisions can most often be avoided for APIs or API products. Again, whenever I say API, I imply API products. So we already talked about it. API products are collections of collaborating resources that always go together, and each resource is a collection of endpoints behind the same path element. So when we are talking about versioning, we are applying these versions to an API product, not to individual endpoints. So patch revisions typically don't apply. Now, does a minor version mean anything to APIs? So by minor version, we are talking about changes to an contract that are backward compatible. So we might add a new resource, brand new resource altogether, or we might add a new endpoint to an existing resource, or we might add more parameters to a query, right? Or we might add more properties to a representation. So all of these are examples of changes that preserve backward compatibility. So can we describe them with a minor revision? We can, right? And if we can, do we or should we communicate these to our consumers? We are not breaking any compatibility, right? If we make a minor revision change, they don't have to change anything, and whatever they are consuming keeps working as before. Should we communicate it to them or not?
I think yes.
We should, right? Because if there is something new you are rolling out, even though compatibility is preserved, they definitely should be communicated. And um, if there are incremental additions to representations or to queries, we should communicate them as well. So I think the reason why we are trying to manage APIs as product is to bring product discipline, and communication around what's coming, what is changing is an important part of product lifecycle management, right? So we have to communicate all version changes to our both existing as well as prospective uh, consumers. Now, what about major version change? What does that mean? It typically would imply breaking compatibility. If we break compatibility, is it the same product, or is it a different product altogether? That's what we should start with. What do we mean when we say it's a major version of a product? Or what do we mean when we say we are breaking compatibility? Let's say I have an endpoint called titles, and titles has maybe an attribute called title label, let's say, and I drop this attribute, let's say. Is that a breaking change? right? Or if I have an ability to delete a title and I decide not to allow anyone to delete a title anymore, right? We just change it to mark a title as deprecated. We never allow them to delete it anymore, right? So I need to take away delete. Is that a breaking change?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
So there are going to be points in the life cycle of a product where you may have to break compatibility. So let's say this delete becomes a big issue. Doesn't look like one, but let's say it becomes a big issue. And if you have an API product that has titles and then authors, publishers, users, let's say holds, all as part of one API product. All that is changing is we are taking away delete. What happens to versioning for authors, publishers, holds, and everything else? Do we keep authors as at V1 and titles at V2, or does it impact all of these? So the big question is, are we versioning an endpoint? Are we versioning a resource? Or are we versioning an entire API product? Or are we versioning the entire API platform itself? Yes, Manipal?
Is it specific to resource? Because
So it kind of, right, it depends on, you could do it at any level, but it depends on what kind of value are you trying to achieve out of your product packaging. It also depends on how you are bundling these things together. So typically, if your API product is a set of collaborating resources and you are using one open API schema, right, definition for your entire API product, any breaking changes are going to impact the entire API product. So I would recommend maintaining versions at a product level and not at endpoint or resource levels. It just will become unmanageable after a few changes on few of these endpoints or resources. Right? You would just not be able to uh, have a vehicle to communicate those changes. So doing it at a product level makes sense, but that also means that something like dropping this delete on titles is going to force us to create versions for authors, publishers, holds, and everything else. It's not a big deal, but because you may not be changing anything on those other resources for the second version, the only thing we have to remember is any outgoing version needs to be lifecycle managed and still concurrently hosted, which is important. So what it means is you have to support any outgoing major version for an amount of time that depends on your versioning policy. So your versioning policy, if it says, right, that you're going to post deprecation, you're going to support an outgoing version for a period of, let's say, 18 months, then that is the minimum amount of time you have to offer to your consumers to move away from an outgoing version onto the next version. So that also brings in the need to have an API versioning policy in place to start with. If you don't have an API policy, and if you have kind of a legal contract in terms of providing your APIs to consumers, right, you will find that you have no legs to ever take away a functioning version. And that's a hard place to be in. So you should always make sure that you put together a versioning policy that clearly describes the minimum amount of time you would be hosting an outgoing major version once you declare um, kind of a deprecation, right, for that version. So that brings us to the life cycle of our products, right? So typically your API products should have a life cycle that should say either it is in design phase, and that is not so important to communicate externally than to internally. So you may have an internal design phase. As soon as you're ready to launch, you may have a beta phase where you're trying to still test out your APIs with your partners. And this is the phase where things could change, right? You don't really preserve the notion of backward compatibility, right? You might be changing things in incompatible ways as well. Then you have the notion of a live API product where you start preserving compatibility. And then you may declare the API as deprecated at some point. So this is the point when you announce that you intend to take down this endpoint at some point in the future, and you have a backward incompatible change on this version. And then you have finally a retired phase when you actually take away the endpoint. So deprecated endpoints are still live, right? You're just not allowing any more new subscriptions at this point. Now, how do we model our versioning, right? So one scheme that is heavily recommended is to put your version, the major version revision, as the most significant, at the most significant place in your path, followed by, so let me actually describe it as /v, the major version M, followed by the namespace, followed by your primary resource. So we don't need to care about minor versions in our endpoints because they are backward compatible, right? They are only for communication purposes, but major version should reflect in your path so that you have a V1 library titles that could coexist with a V2 library titles at the same time. And then over time, you're going to deprecate this and retire this, right? While allowing your users to move over to the new endpoint. Now, other ways of supporting a version include putting it into header, or right, sometimes allowing a client to specify a release number or a timeline, right? Some kind of a date to indicate what version, as of what date they want to connect to. Yes, Usha, did you have a question?
Yeah. So what would you prefer, putting it in a URL path or the header? Like if it was an interview question, what would the recommended answer be?
Yeah. So my own preference is to put it into the path. And the reason for that is it helps us manage our endpoints, right? Formally as API products. So there is no other hidden piece of information. Another thing is, because these endpoints are realizable endpoints, right? Having this forced into the path, make sure that you have to have a concurrent endpoint hosted for your version, right? You're not just have a logical endpoint that is routing across multiple implementations, right? You also have to force a physical endpoint to represent a major version. So I would prefer that, but
Okay.
it's something that you can certainly, you are free to choose for your own API style and conventions. Whatever you have it, you should push it into your style guide to be
Okay.
consistently adopted across your entire company or product line.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Right? A lot of engineers prefer it in headers because then they could do a lot of smart things, right? Their application, same deployment could serve as a lot of different things. You could still do it with this because your V1 and V2, both of these paths could point or direct to the same hosted application, and you could do it. But yeah, I think I would just have a more customer centric explicit view of a version rather than let them keep guessing, right? Depending on whether it is part of a header or not, things behave differently, right? That creates a lot of risky behavior, right? If people are not careful.